Thanks for tuning in to Liberación Army Radio. This is episode 6 of our podcast. It was supposed to be aired on April 28th, 2025, but as of right now, it's going to be aired on May 1st. This is because I had finals and editing was just not going well. And on top of that, I have a couple additions to add to the podcast that I think are really important to our Global South segment and international politics. So I'm going to talk about those. But first, we're going to do some introductions.
My name is Ryan. I use they, them pronouns, and I am an LCSW with lots of nonprofit experience, currently providing therapy and consulting in my private practice. I'm here with my co host, Ome.
This is our first time doing introductions.
Yeah.
It's interesting. My name is Ome. I accept all pronouns. I'm a student completing my political science and sociology double major.
We will be talking about Judge Hannah Dugan, who was arrested by the Trump administration earlier this week, and the death of Pope Francis. Next, we'll cover a brief regarding migrants who have been unlawfully detained. And then we'll touch on international politics about U.S. interference in Mexico. And our general topic for today will be about systems of American oppression and what we think of the direction of the U.S. Start with current events, domestic. What do you think of the death of Pope Francis? It was really all over the news. Everybody was talking about it this week.
Pope Francis is probably one of the most left wing popes there ever has been.
I would agree with that.
And this is an interesting thing because everybody sort of knows that when popes become a part of the papacy, they are going to not live for very much longer, really, as popes. They're usually elected around their late 60s or early 70s, and they usually pass away around their 80s. A pope can die at any time, so it's not really that strange. But what makes Pope Francis's case particularly interesting is because he has made the case that if he were to view the world from a sociologist lens, that he would consider himself a communist, which I think is really, really, really left. He's also advocated for gay rights inside of the Catholic Church, and he, as a lot of people know, has maintained a constant communique with the churches in Gaza. Well, he used to call them every day. I do think that it will be influential, whatever happens next. And I also think that there's a lot to be said about what exactly is going to happen depending on the next pope that they elect. I wanted to talk a little bit about a Times article that came out discussing which potential popes could be chosen. Do you know how popes are elected? It's actually really interesting.
I know it's a very secretive process, and there needs to be, they vote again and again until there's a majority.
Yeah, and it doesn't last that long. They're not allowed to leave.
Yeah.
They have this debate. They lock themselves into this room, and there are some contenders that people really like, and I'm gonna talk about them really quickly here. We don't have a lot of time today, but I did want to touch on potential contenders, and this is important. We should care about this as leftists, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I'm talking about these figures because you could make the case that the Catholic Church, is probably one of the most powerful entities on the planet. One of the first possible contenders is Pier Battista Pizzaballa, and he's Italian. He's the Vatican's top official for Middle East affairs. He has actually gotten experience in conflict zones. He is very openly pro Palestine. Another one is Pietro Parolin, and he is the second in command for Pope Francis. He's very mild mannered. Pietro Parolin. So he is actually advocated for less westernized Catholic institutions in places like Vietnam, for example. So he's
Hmm.
like trying to like put more Vietnamese looking churches inside of Vietnam. He's also built Palestinian relationships as well, similar to the former pope. Advocacy for the end of climate change and human trafficking. Those are his like big headliner
Mhm.
problems that he advocates against.
Mhm.
There's Fridolin Ambongo. He is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, actually.
Hmm.
He would be potentially the first black pope, but he's a homophobe, actually.
Mm.
So a lot of people are really concerned with him potentially being and bringing conservative values back into the Catholic Church. This is of great concern to Catholics because they've seen a decline in religious participation, really,
Mhm.
because the world is increasingly becoming more secular.
Mhm.
So that's a concern for a lot of people. And he led the opposition of Francis's 2023 ruling that the church should bless homosexual couples.
Oh.
Yeah,
That's
is
interesting that he's up on the docket.
yeah, he's number 3 actually, according to
That's
New
pretty
York
close.
Times. Next is Luis Antonio Tagle. He is actually Southeast Asian. He
Yeah.
is from the Philippines.
Yeah.
And he is liberal leaning. He I don't think that he is a very strong contender personally. I do think that his probably biggest asset is that he is obviously somebody who is deeply connected to a country that is highly Catholic, which is the Philippines.
Mhm.
Next is Mateo Zuppi. He is 69. He reflects Francis's view that the church should be representative of the poor, meaning that like they should always support the poor. And he is also somewhat progressive. He's very interested in conflict resolution overseas. He is very welcoming, and he is also been welcoming of the LGBT Catholics. So he's kind of like supported a lot of Pope Francis's advocacy. Next is Peter Erdo of Hungary. He is would be a very young potential candidate. He is very interested in guarding traditional Christian faith. So he's kind of conservative. I'm pretty sure that he has spoken out against migrants, which is weird.
Hmm.
And he doesn't think that divorced Catholics could should receive communion. Yeah, so
That's a
he's
lot of Catholics.
yeah, he does not like that. Then next is Anders Arborellis. He's of Stockholm. He has expressed support for migrants and voiced opposition to same-sex couples. Really, that's like the big ticket items for this
Hmm.
these candidates is whether or not they support gay marriage or migrants. That's their whole thing. And then
Hmm.
there's one that he is a Zionist.
Straight up?
Yeah. Oh, it's Cardinal Erdo. Yeah. So he said that he frequently attends Holocaust memorials, and Jewish leaders say his support has been crucial at a time of the rise of the far right and growing anti-Semitism in Hungary.
Hmm.
Yeah, he's a Zionist.
Mhm.
And he's the one that also opposes migrants and divorced Catholics taking communion. So he's really conservative. He's on the
Okay.
right.
He probably won't get it.
I don't know.
I think it's unlikely.
I mean, I do think that out of everybody, there are a lot less conservative potential candidates for being pope, but I really don't know what the likelihood is because, quite honestly, I haven't really followed it that closely until Pope Francis because I have no interest in conservative Catholicism.
Mhm.
So I thought that was pretty interesting, especially that there's a pro Israel and pro Judaism Catholic. Like that's fascinating to me. But also that there's a DRC potential black pope who is a homophobe. Like I think that's really interesting too.
I wonder if he's APAC funded. I don't know if that's even possible.
Well, there it wouldn't be APAC because APAC is the American PAC, but I wouldn't be
Oh.
surprised if he was being paid for by, Israeli donations to the Catholic Church
Huh.
or that kind of thing. Like,
The Catholic Church does have quite a bit of reach.
yeah, and they do receive a lot of donations.
Mhm.
But I think the Catholic Church has more reach than the state of Israel.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think it makes a lot of sense that they have a potential pope maybe in their pocket
Mhm.
and that they're advocating for that specific pope to make it. But he might be the biggest wheel the biggest spoke in the wheel to try to stop um, somebody from being confirmed. But thankfully, it requires like I think like 2/3
Yeah, that's
or
why it takes
something
so
like
long.
that. Yeah, it takes like 2/3. So it even if he opposes, as long as 2/3 agree,
Hmm.
then it should be fine. And if they confirm Pope Francis, then maybe we could get another progressive. Who knows? But I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to put that out there because I thought it was an interesting story.
Yeah.
And the reason this is relevant also to domestic politics is actually that JD Vance, obviously, everybody's heard about this. This is not even news at this point. This is practically gossip. JD Vance was the essentially last person to see Pope Francis.
Right.
And immediately after, he died.
Yeah.
And then just before he passed, he spent his final moments advocating for the people of Palestine, which is not surprising. And Temoris Grecko, who's my favorite guerrilla war journalist coming out of Mexico, he wrote an article called The Pope Who Called a Genocide, Genocide. It's in Spanish. I'm putting it in the show notes. If you have time to read the article, it's such a good piece. He specifically writes about war and he goes to conflict zones and he's been to Palestine and been to different parts that are actively experiencing the genocide. He's also reported in Lebanon immediately after the more recent Lebanese attacks. So his article is really interesting if you have a chance to read it. During the funeral, Trump met with Vladimir Zelensky
Hmm.
immediately after his second in command, essentially quintessentially like the Pope died immediately after. Whether or not it was because of JD Vance is totally speculation,
Hmm.
but I do think that it's like so disrespectful to organize a political meet at a funeral. Like, it's distasteful. It's especially for a pope who was pro-Palestine, and Volodymyr Zelensky is famously very much in support of Israel. Ukraine is like Israel that's being subject by Russian terrorists, which
Hmm.
I don't actually think that makes me personally sympathetic to Ukraine. Also, Ukraine actually violated the United Nations when Ukraine tried to join NATO, which is a military alliance that is, by textbook definition, an act of war. And it opens them up to conflict with Russia, which is why you're not seeing the UN meaningfully intervene in the Russia Ukraine conflict. But they are also condemning Russia for its disproportionate attacks on Ukrainian civilians. Even though the response of Russia has been ruled probable genocide, the actual war itself is legally sanctioned by the UN. Just to be clear, Israel, of course, is not getting anywhere near the same treatment. And I think it's interesting that Trump is having these discussions essentially with the Pope's body in the background. And there's a really good Mexican cartoon coming out of La Jornada, if you have a chance to look it up, of Trump and Zelensky sitting on the Pope's coffin having a discussion with the Pope's body in the background.
Interesting stuff. He really doesn't care. He's
Trump,
like, yeah. Well, he's like, oh, guess we're both here, you know?
I know it's really, really impolite. I mean, the impolite is like not the worst thing that Trump could be. Like he's so much worse than that in other ways. But I do think it's opportunistic and
Yeah.
like just such a disrespect, especially because Russia historically is Catholic and Ukraine, therefore, is also historically Catholic.
Hmm.
So I think it's interesting that, you know, you have all these war criminals there. And by the way, Putin, I don't think he's allowed to go to Italy because of potentially UN court orders or something like that for his detainment.
Mm.
So he obviously was not in attendance
Hmm.
at the funeral, even though he comes from a country that is profoundly Catholic.
It would have been interesting to have him and Zelensky at the funeral
They should
together.
just fight, honestly.
They really should just duke it out and figure things out that way. I think Putin would win.
Yeah, I think Russian and Ukrainian citizens are paying the price for Ukrainian aggression and trying to ally itself with the US, but also they're paying for Russian sort of previous dreams of reinstitutionalizing the Soviet Union. But
Hmm.
Russia is in its right to attack Ukraine. And at the same time, it's not in its right to disproportionately attack civilians. That is obviously out of the question.
Hmm. On to the next topic. I'm sure we've heard of the judge that was arrested last week.
Yeah, her name was Judge Hannah Dugan. She was the Milwaukee County Circuit Judge who was arrested by the FBI on Friday, April 25th, so just a couple days ago. And she was charged in federal court for helping an undocumented immigrant avoid arrest. That is a massive escalation. It's completely different than sort of previous arrests on judges. Because arrests on judges do happen and somewhat frequently, I would say, relatively frequently, but they've never been publicized. In fact, there are laws that the Department of Justice has institutionalized that do not allow for these justices to be publicly sort of arrested. It's an intimidation tactic. It's a cronyist move, and
Mm,
it's also illegal. It's
hmm
illegal to take their photo while they're being arrested. Judges specifically, they have a legal sovereignty that is codified into the Department of Justice's law. So, yeah, isn't that interesting?
That is interesting. I'm looking it up right now. So they're saying that so the person that she was trying to protect, quote unquote, and he was in there for a misdemeanor battery charge.
Yeah, and just to be clear, she didn't actually hide the immigrant. She put the, she opened her private door
Hmm
to the hallway of the public part of the courtroom.
mm
That's all she did. She let the immigrant out. She didn't even like order anything. She didn't try to do anything. She didn't hide anybody. She didn't not let officers or ICE agents into her courtroom. She
hmm
literally just said, ICE is ridiculous. You're being ridiculous, and let people out into a public space because she didn't want people being detained in her courtroom.
hmm
I think that is absolutely ridiculous. The Trump administration is so embarrassing.
Truly. I know they're trying to get her with concealing and
Probably aiding and
obstructing
obstructing justice.
obstructing justice.
She is justice.
Yeah. Speaking of migrants, let's go to an update on our migrant cases here.
So we've been following Mahmoud Khalil. There's really not a lot to report except for that Mahmoud Khalil is seeking to allow press into his immigration proceedings. Now, this is different than criminal law. Criminal law does allow for the press to come into the court proceedings as a matter of the First Amendment, so the freedom of speech. However, for civil cases, because this is like a constitutional situation, in Mahmoud's case has progressed to the point of a constitutional case, that it's up to the judge whether or not the press will be allowed inside of this civil case. So we don't know what exactly the judge will say, but I do think it makes sense to have the press involved in this case.
Hmm
Hopefully, they do grant the ability for the press to enter, but it's kind of like a can of worms that once you open, you can't close. So if anything comes out about Mahmoud Khalil, it could be bad for the case. Even if it's something that's not necessarily morally bad, but if it's legally bad, it could be harmful, right? Because it could be immediately publicized and that could turn the public against Mahmoud Khalil. He's really allowing essentially for the public to try him, but it will also aid as a weapon for public outrage if Mahmoud Khalil can make his case. So hopefully we'll see the press at his civil case pretty soon here.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen how social media it can both hurt and help
Right.
people's cases. I think a lot of people are keeping their eyes on this case too.
I think it's a disgrace, honestly. Freedom of speech, who?
Yeah. I mean, they're trying to disappear him, so it makes sense that he would want more more press.
Yeah, I'm worried that they're going to take him out, to be honest,
Yeah.
because he's so vocal. Speaking of other migrants, have you heard about Juan Carlos Gomez Lopez?
No, I haven't.
So he is a American born citizen.
Mm,
He's born here in the US. He spent some time living in Mexico. He is a Tzotzil speaking Mayan. He had been arrested by ICE, and the judge ordered his release. But because ICE had him on a 48-hour hold, they weren't they wouldn't return him within that 48-hour hold, even though he was a citizen, and the Floridian judge verified his birth certificate. And it was
mm,
because he spoke his first language is Tzotzil, which is
mm,
Mayan language, which for those of you who don't know, it's a native language. A language is native to the Americas,
mm.
specifically North America. So anyway, I think that is just ridiculous also.
Yeah. We're really living in a time we're detaining indigenous people at this point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has also already happened where ICE has tried to detain some people who are Navajo at the Mexico US border.
Mm,
It's huge escalation. Huge escalation. It's also very much like a modern day witch hunt. You know, the Trump administration is looking for the witch, and
mm.
the witch these days is the Latino migrant, the pro Palestine student, and trans people. The last thing that I have to add to the podcast today is kind of a trivial matter, or at least on the surface, it's kind of a trivial matter. But there was a variety of neoliberal sort of debate bros who unironically go onto places like Jubilee to debate Nazis. One of them is very popular political commentator Dean Withers. By the way, this is all alleged. A lot of this is rumor, so please keep that in mind. None of this has been verified, but I am going to talk within the context of the things that people have alleged. First and foremost, there are approximately $100,000 in grassroots donations that have evaporated. And the tour itself, the Unfuck America tour, was essentially going to follow Charlie Kirk around the country, who is a Nazi, and try to debate him, try to get Dean Withers to debate him alongside a few other liberal influencers, including some Black influencers that were last minute additions because Black Americans complained that there was not a lot of representation on the Unfuck America tour. Now, it's unsurprising, but the tour didn't work out. One of the primary reasons that it didn't work out is because the organizer, I'm shocked, everybody's shocked, said a bunch of microaggressive and racist things. And it later also came out that Dean Withers was smearing another Black woman for allegedly harassing him of some sort of personal issue. And originally she was supposed to be on the tour, but she wasn't allowed to. The whole thing is a total disaster. It's a mess. And I think it's pretty interesting because I said this in my TikTok video, but I wanted to put it on the podcast too. I wanted to put it on wax. You have capitalists who are trying to make capital. And I think a lot of people are also shocked in this situation because there was a Black woman who defended the failures of the Unfuck America tour. And this is because she was supposed to be on the tour, she was supposed to be paid as well. And the tour itself has completely fallen apart, including all of the payments that have come from grassroots donations in to the tune of $100,000. And there was supposed to be more coming in as well. Dean Withers, by the way, and all of the people who are on this Unfuck America tour, these were Democrat darlings during the elections. These are people who are explicit liberals. They are rad liberals, and they believe that the liberation of American people is under the Democratic Party. These are people who do not understand that liberalism is an ideological approach to capitalism and that they are capitalists. And if they do understand, then that makes things a lot worse. But anyway, I just wanted to put this on your radar if you wanted to look at some chisme and you wanted to see capitalists being capitalists. And the end result of all of this was that this Black woman who is a part of the tour, who was originally a part of the tour that was defending Dean Withers, basically called out another influencer who was pointing out that there was racism at the helm of this campaign. Now we'll be putting this back in to our regularly scheduled podcast. Now we're going to be moving on to Palestine, Sudan, and Congo. But before we do that, there is a story that I forgot to put in here. If you have seen the video, but there was a Jewish Israeli woman that was at a pro Palestine rally in New York, and she was brutally attacked by a group of Israelis in New York City. I think she had a broken lip, like a busted lip, and they kicked her in the stomach and in the face. It's really bad. They attacked her. But
Yeah, it was. I saw the video too. It was like a whole mob of men.
a literal mob of men attacking a singular woman. And they didn't know. They thought that she was Arab. They were chanting death to Arab to her, but she actually is Israeli. She's
Yeah,
an
she's not even Arab. She
she's
was just wearing a kufiya.
yeah, she was an Israeli Jew,
Yeah.
and she posted a photo of herself smiling and bleeding out of her mouth in the kufiya, and she said, I wish those settlers I hope that those settlers know that I'm an Israeli Jew, just like them. I have a passport like theirs, or something like that. But yeah, I thought it was so cool. Probably the coolest Israeli I've ever seen, except for those other Israelis who are trying to oppose settlers in Palestine. Moving on to your update for Palestine, Sudan, and Congo.
The blockade continues to get worse. It's affecting a lot of people, and 55 children died last week as a result of the blockade. And the UN says that its food stocks are completely depleted because of the blockade. So that is continuing to get worse. Also coming out of Al Jazeera, there's a new documentary about the genocide in Gaza. This was released by the BBC. It's called The Settlers. You should check it out.
It's by Luz Thoreau, by the way.
Al Jazeera also reported today that a drone strike killed a few children. As per usual, Israel is continuing to target women and children through starvation and airstrikes.
Yeah, the story about 55 children that died last week as a result of hunger. I wanted to put this on your radar because it was actually something that Bisan said earlier today. Bisan said for the first time that unfortunately she's still alive. So if you're familiar with Bisan's videos, she starts off her videos by saying, "This is Bisan from Gaza, and I'm still alive." And today she said, "And unfortunately, I'm still alive." And that made me really sad. But I wanted to platform her headline and her story.
Moving on to Sudan, that is the country with the most internally displaced population worldwide as of last week. Do you want to speak more to that?
So essentially, because of the rapid support forces, there have been forced migration campaigns throughout Sudan, which has forced Sudanese people to sort of move away from wherever the aggression is happening. And as a result, they've, of course, abandoned their homes, which is why they're spread out more throughout the country. Of course, that leads to internal displacement, meaning that they don't have a home, meaning that they're just like a giant homeless population.
I think there was a more recent video. I saw part of this video too. That there's 31 people that were killed by the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, by execution. That's a pretty blatant war crime, but still, I think it's really hard to get any news out of Sudan.
Yeah, it's unusual to see video footage as well, so for it to be caught on camera is kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
So, Congo, tell me about the ceasefire deal.
Congo, Rwanda, and Marco Rubio from the U.S. They met on the 25th to draft, or at least start drafting, a peace deal by May 2nd. It's kind of just for show, in my opinion. There's been about, I think, 5 or 6 peace deals or ceasefires that have been signed but not followed through. The thing that's different about this one is that the U.S. is involved. Assuming that this one will fall through too, it will give America more permission to intervene.
Yeah, this is a classic case of US intervention.
Hmm.
Obviously, if they want to negotiate a ceasefire deal, then the US has to pull any kind of support that they've had they need to pull out all of their supports from M23. Just want to add really quickly here that Congo and Burkina Faso are directly connected to each other because Ibrahim Traore, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, who is the military leader of Burkina Faso, is one of the most prominent African leftist leaders that there is right now. Ibrahim Traore has nationalized the country's resources, kicked out France, and done a variety of radical things in an effort to unify Africa. This is incredibly significant, and I really can't understate how important his role is in Africa right now. Michael Langley, General Michael Langley, he recently was all over headlines because of his criticisms of West Africa and especially the way that he portrayed the military leadership in various countries. He stated that had faced a variety of military coups with countries like Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali. The coups in question were of dictatorships that were backed by the United States and Western entities, including the French, who have absolutely ravaged West Africa. Pretty much, there have been very few leaders that have been willing to stand up to Western hegemony, but especially US hegemony. And I think a lot of people are shocked, a little bit more shocked, because General Langley is Black. And it's interesting to see somebody who has direct connections to the reasons that West Africa is profoundly marginalized and yet has chosen the side of the oppressor. I just really encourage people to keep an eye on what's happening in the global south and generally to try and find holes in the arguments that the United States is making and to listen to people who are on the ground, especially citizen press, who are documenting what is happening in their respective country. And I'm talking about citizen press, not podcasters, people who have a reputation for reporting accurate news. This came on my radar because I follow various citizen press coming out of Kenya who repost a variety of things regarding coups and attempted coups in Africa by the US, by France, by the UK, and by other Western entities that don't have good intentions for Africa. But now I wanted to move on to other intervention campaigns the US is doing specifically in Mexico. And this week, they're doing two different interventions. Normally, I reserve a little bit of space to talk about Indigenous politics as well, but we don't have a lot of time today. First and foremost, Kristi Noam aired a US propaganda video in a bunch of Mexican channels. Did you hear about that?
You mentioned it, but I actually haven't listened to it. I'm gonna.
So the video itself is Kristi Noam, and actually this is why I'm bringing this up. Most people have seen the video in Mexico. It's actually essentially a propaganda campaign. This propaganda campaign is centered on making sure that migrants don't enter the United States, specifically Mexican migrants, because it aired primarily on TV Azteca, which is a Mexican channel, as well as Televisa. Mostly it aired throughout all of Mexican channels in all of Mexico, but those are the two main ones that I think are most notable because they're prominent channels in Mexico. 53% of them migrated here before the year 2000. Mexican people are not immigrating to the US anymore. It's actually, there's a phenomena called reverse migration,
Mm-hmm.
and Mexicans are mostly returning back to Mexico and in increasing numbers annually.
Mm-hmm.
Not even because of deportation, literally just because they don't want to be here anymore. The people that they're actually targeting with this ad is obviously going to be Central and South Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum yesterday, it was either yesterday or the day before, in a press briefing, she said that she was going to be introducing a bill to ban foreign propaganda. But as of April 28th, earlier this morning, the the ad was still running and it actually is not banned. So
Mm,
a bill has been introduced to ban it, but it is not banned. And the reason that this ban hasn't happened yet is because there's a legal loophole in the Mexican law around propaganda that was institutionalized by American backed President Felipe Calderon.
mm, perfect.
Right. So that's why it's not actually banned yet. And media outlets reporting that it's been banned are reporting incorrectly. It has not been banned yet,
Mm,
is actually still airing. And the only way that it will stop airing is if the bill that is moving to ban foreign propaganda gets codified into Mexican law. And that is obviously, it's a bureaucracy situation, so it's going to take a while. So it might still continue to air for an indefinite period of time.
mm.
A lot of Mexicans are calling for the boycott of Mexican channels that aired the ad, which I think makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because obviously, why would you allow that? Ads are not just like apolitical.
I know somebody sat and approved it. Somebody sat and looked at it and was like, "Yeah, we're gonna put this on our show or put this on our channel." It says that she spent 200 million
That's not that much.
to produce it and advertise it.
That is not that much money. It should
Mm.
cost more to air an advertisement. If you're going to air a propaganda campaign on a Mexican channel, it should be a billion at least. That's the situation with Kristi Noam. I don't think that it makes a lot of sense for them to air these ads for Mexican people because the majority of the people that are entering are, as I said, from Central and South America. And again, I always like to point this out, but migration happens as a result of US foreign policy, meaning
Mhm.
that the American government goes into other countries, destabilizes them, and because they're destabilized, they have to leave, or because of climate change. Climate crisis migration is a direct result of the American military being one of the world's biggest polluters. Not to mention the fact that American celebrities pollute the planet as
Mhm.
well, indiscriminately, pretty much. Like Taylor Swift
Yep.
flying from like 2 feet away on her little jet. Next is there's an American smear on China on a Chinese company called Time Ceramics. Okay. Now, here's the situation. Time Ceramics is being alleged by Mexican employees to having unlawfully fired several, either 200 employees, maybe a little bit more than that, but allegedly they have fired some number of employees. And one of the employees is alleging that the CEO, who's a Chinese man, kicked him and brutalized him. These allegations could be true. Let's just say that they could be true. So I did some digging into Time Ceramics. First of all, this came onto my radar because I got a bunch of anti-China comments on my one of my most recent videos about Kristi Noam and US intervention. And the video that originally scandalized this piece is a gossip rag that is pro Trump. So a woman named, I think like Gigi, she's a podcaster in Mexico.
Mm.
She has gone to Time Ceramics and she's interviewing these Mexican workers. She also essentially is either PRIAN or a Movimiento Ciudadano advocate,
Mm.
which are far right political parties in Mexico that ask for and believe in American intervention in Mexico.
Mm.
The US has spent some billions of dollars on smearing China internationally. So this is interesting to me because let's assume that these allegations are true for a moment. Let's let's make that assumption that Time Ceramics did these things. Well, I looked into Time Ceramics. Here's what I found. I found that their parent company is actually not Chinese. They're multiple country owned. They have a holdings organization, a holdings group that is based out of the Philippines, Australia, the UK, the US, and of course, a variety of other countries, including Mexican ownership. So
Mm.
the parent company is also Mexican owned. just to be very clear here. It's multi-country, multinationally owned, and it's private. So it's not just Chinese owners doing things to Mexican people. That's an incorrect assessment of the situation. There's also a Mexican owner who is allowing these things to happen and who is certainly exploiting the situation for himself. The other allegation is that there's been being work that's being exported from this Chinese company to China, which doesn't make sense because if it's a Chinese company, then obviously they're going to have workers in China. They also have a plant in China.
Mm.
So naturally, some of the work is going to go to wherever it's cheaper. And some of it's not going to be able to come into the US because they provide a lot of products for American companies because of the tariffs. Finally, Time Ceramics was embroiled in a bunch of scandals in 2024 because they were using Mexican water illegally during a drought. Coca Cola has been doing this and exploiting Mexican workers and not paying Mexican workers and quite literally letting Mexican workers die for literal decades. I just think it's interesting that this is coming up in such a stilted way and from these gossip rags. And by the way, none of this is confirmed. All of this is alleged, and all we have is a grainy video from a far right podcaster who's a Prianista, who is a
Mhm.
Trumper, and her videos are the entire basis of this accusation. No legitimate mainstream media outlets, Mexican or otherwise, have reported on this. It's literally all on TikTok.
She got paid.
I think so too. Personally, if I'm going to give my opinion, I think she is a propagandist, a provocateur, if you will.
Totally. It's such low hanging fruit, too.
The US has a really big bone to pick with China, and right now they have to look for ways to expropriate labor from Mexico.
Mm.
And the Trump administration has an axe to grind with Mexico. It makes a lot of sense for them to smear their biggest commercial partner right now because the US does not want China to benefit from Mexican labor, from the Mexican peso, or from any Chinese Mexico relationships.
Mm.
Even though China has huge investments in the trains, in infrastructure in Mexico, like China has always been a benefactor to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes a lot of sense that the Trump administration would try to smear China. In fact, this has actually already been happening under the Biden administration. Biden was always smearing China in Mexico as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the same exact thing that happened with Tren Maya. Those are my 2 cents personally. I think this is 100% a propaganda campaign. And I do think that if there is any legitimacy, thankfully, Mexican people do have legal avenues to resist any kind of potential exploitation, including labor exploitation. So I don't think there should be a problem with them potentially invoking a lawsuit and suing the shit out of this corporation if they really are that exploitative. By the way, this is happening in Hidalgo. Hidalgo is one of the only states in Mexico that has a PRI backed governor.
What?
Yeah,
That makes a lot of sense now.
yeah, right. And this is exactly what happened with the Tren Maya situation. They're always trying to smear either the Mexican government or whoever by using partisan political politics, partisan party politics, favorably platforming the PRI and the PAN, but unfavorably platforming Morena, even though these things are all happening under the PRI and the PAN administrations, as well as Movimiento Ciudadano. Just like the ranch situation happened under Movimiento Ciudadano. And nobody likes to talk about that. Everybody points a finger at Morena because of the federal government right now. But the federal government, just like the United States, does not have as much control about states' laws and more domestic cases, which is what this would be.
Mm.
This is a problem between the CEO, the execs,
Mm.
and the Mexican workers, and they do need to organize some kind of lawsuit if they have evidence of their allegations, which I'm assuming they do.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's true, I think they're kind of like taking an inch and turning it into a mile. You know,
Right. I
it's
don't
just
understand
it's
how
too far right now.
I don't understand how like the logic for me doesn't work. I think
It's
the
like you
one
don't even go here.
the one thing that I do think that has weight is a potential beating, but obviously there's going to be physical evidence of that.
Right.
Um, but also beyond that, there would be direct evidence of potentially expropriating work to China.
Mhm.
So if they wanted to sue about that, it would be a very simple suit. It wouldn't take them a lot of effort. And it's
Yeah.
not like there aren't legal avenues that the public in Mexico will support if if this is actually happening. So to me, it comes across as very disingenuous and like either these workers are being paid for by propagandists or it's a complete fabrication or if it is true, it's being weaponized. Could be any of the scenarios. I've seen worse absolutely come out of the United States.
Yeah. Okay, let's transition into our general topic for today, which is on systems of American oppression and future predictions. So we're going to start with giving a little context here about a TikTok video.
Yeah, so I posted a video way back earlier this year. I don't even remember when, about how the American empire is actually predicted to fall in 2025 and that Chinese hegemony is going to become the new norm. And I want to add a little bit to that video because I think that things have kind of changed a little bit. In that video, I said that we saw a mass migration from TikTok over to Xiaohongshu as a result of the ban and that a lot of propaganda was going to be unpacked by Americans. And I feel like people owe me an apology because I got a bunch of comments under that video, people saying that it didn't matter and that it didn't have as much of an impact as I thought it did, and that like it was just not quite on the money. But I think that mass migration set the stage for ISO speeds um, traveling through China and really exposing the general public to a completely different face of China. Have you seen his videos?
I have. I also, yeah, I think the whole migration, I remember it being like China was learning so much about how poorly Americans lived, and Americans learned so much about how well Chinese people lived at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it also really changed the way that people are perceiving Chinese communism versus American capitalism and the systems of oppression that functionally work in the US. And I'm not going to say that China doesn't have systems of oppression, they do, but they're certainly a lot more mitigated. And this goes back to the fact that China has a more than 90% home ownership rate.
Mhm.
We're talking about people who don't have to rent. Can you imagine not having to rent?
I know people on Xiaohongshu was like, "You rent? You have to pay for healthcare? That's crazy."
Yeah, and it does depend what city you're in because they
Yeah.
have tiers of cities. So they have definitely certain people groups that are marginalized in different ways, but they do not have anywhere near the level of marginalization as there is in the United States or class disparity. The United States has the biggest class disparity pretty much in the world. And so I think that people seeing that China has a completely different function when it comes to the way that it treats its working class. You know, to me, it was obvious that any exposure to this was really going to undermine American propaganda, which, by the way, they allotted, I think it was like 8 billion earlier this year, some wacky number like that, um, to disseminate more anti China propaganda.
I'm ready for Chinese hegemony. I'm ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was the context of the original video. And I got this comment from a TikToker.
So the comment is from Your Stellar Truth. Comment is, quote, "But now that they've been eroding our reproductive rights, how does that fit in here?"
This question, I actually made a video and I found myself not being able to answer it because it's such an interesting and profound question. And it comes across as really surface level, but it's actually one of the most complicated questions I've ever received on a TikTok video. It's basically asking me to predict what the American state is going to do now that we are collapsing more overtly into a right wing fascist state. It's also asking me that in the context of reproductive rights, which is a very interesting question for a lot of different reasons. So I want to talk a little bit about that. First, we have to talk about what reproductive rights are, right? Reproductive rights are almost always understood as the freedom to choose to not have a baby. That's like the general public's belief, right?
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of people don't know this, but a reproductive right is also the ability to choose to have a baby. It's both. Ignoring one or the other makes it really challenging for most people to grasp their head around American eugenics, right? So there are certain populations that have reproductive rights when it comes to their ability to choose to not have a baby, but they don't have reproductive rights to choose to be able to have a baby. And this applies differently to different marginalized people groups. It really depends on your personal relationship to labor. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So first, we have to actually talk about race, though, and eugenics. Do you know about eugenics?
I think it would be good to have a definition for eugenics.
So eugenics are a pseudoscience. So eugenics is related to the Herrenvolk of Germany, aka the master race sort of pseudoscience that they have about pure whiteness. We talked a little bit about what whiteness is in our last podcast and how it's not a real thing. Like the whole concept of the genocide of white people is not possible because whiteness is a phenotype, it's not a culture or a race.
Mhm.
In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that the only race that was actually invented truly was the black race and that there's no other race. And this has a lot of complicated sort of undertones that basically argue that your relationship to race is directly connected to how you're perceived in the context of blackness. And I thought it was a really interesting argument. This is in a book called The Color Line, or a concept called The Color Line by W.B. Du Bois. It's pretty interesting because the foundation, the formulation of the quote black race was essentially setting the standard for how people of color were going to be treated in the US because previous there wasn't any other race by the census actually. It was just black or white. These are people groups that are stratified still obviously, especially during Jim Crow, but they're not overtly stratified until or they're not overtly classed as a specific race until later. And so it really, really depends on your relationship to blackness, how you're being perceived by uh, eugenics. Now we have to talk about what the pillars of capitalism are. The pillars of capitalism are the same things that are the pillars of the United States, are the same thing that is the pillars of settler colonialism. Elimination of indigenous people and the exploitation of black people. Those two are required to create the American state. Okay? So we have a dispossession of Native American territory, and that requires the complete elimination of that population, right? Because in order to
Mhm.
take the United States, they had to kill the natives,
Yeah, they definitely checked those boxes off.
right? And in order to build American capital, they had to create a working class
Mhm.
and a working class that would work for free. That was the black
Mhm.
enslavement, right? So we know that these are pillars of settler colonialism, which are the pillars of the American state and the pillars of American capitalism.
Mhm.
And this capitalism became the worldwide phenomena for the West. So the West used this all over the rest of the world. Everywhere that the settler went, this was the model that they used. The genocide of an indigenous population and the enslavement of usually the black population of
Mhm.
Africa. And this was unique, a unique evil, because this system took people away from their homeland, making them vulnerable.
Mhm.
So, this is why this is important. So, Black people were being intentionally reproduced in the United States.
Right.
So, this is because the American capitalist needs a working class, right?
Mhm.
When we talk about reproductive rights, if we ignore the elimination of indigenous people, then all we can focus on is the right to reproduce, right?
Mhm.
Because the capitalist, right, the American capitalist, the white man, he is going to move in accordance with a specific agenda to either reproduce a population or eliminate a population.
Mhm.
And it highly depends on whether or not that population occupies a space that has any kind of legal claim to a territory that the capitalist has an interest in,
Mhm.
or that population has an ability to produce labor at free or no or low cost.
I think it's so fucked up. It's like we're gonna not only take away indigenous people, but we're gonna have these other people come in who don't belong to the land, so they can't ever have a claim to the land that we've stolen, right? It's kind of like, a long game, a long-term plan that they're doing, that they've really set in motion.
And I think it's interesting too because it applies very differently to different specific marginalized racial groups. So if we look at, for example, East Asians versus South Asians and their
Mhm.
treatment in the US, it actually has different political implications.
Mhm.
And especially if you look at the difference between Japanese Americans versus, for example, Indian Americans,
Mhm.
the way that their labor is perceived plays a huge role in whether or not the state wants them to have more children.
Mm.
So the Japanese, for example, tend to stay in Japan because they like Japan and they don't want to migrate to the US. The only reason that they would migrate to the US is if and only if there is an economic opportunity for them here because
Mhm.
Japan's economy is not doing very well right now.
Mhm.
India, on the other hand, has a horrible economy. And Indian migrants come here out of sheer desperation.
Mhm.
This leads to work their work being more exploitable.
Right.
And because their work is more exploitable, they are constantly being sought after in working class fields. Not to mention the fact that there is a huge dynamic happening right now between India and Israel because India is also perpetuating a Muslim genocide because of Hindu supremacy. They're a theocratic ethno
Mm,
state
that's true.
and they oppose Islam. So the US has a vested interest in bringing in more Indian migrants.
Mhm.
Whereas Japanese people are not exploited in the same way. They're brought here to get higher educations and they're
Mhm.
brought here to be put in up higher institutions essentially because they're more easily assimilated to American capitalism
Mhm.
and to become a part of the American capitalist class, not to mention the fact that they suit the white supremacist Herrenvolk model much more than an Indian does.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I know you were gonna talk about the model minority myth, but this is really where it comes in.
Yes, the model minority myth, of course, being that Japanese people come here through legal means, similar to Japanese and Koreans being compared to Mexicans, that
Mhm.
Mexicans don't come here through legal means. And again, this completely ignores the fact that the US has done horrendous things to both India and Mexico, and that has essentially provoked the mass migration of these populations.
Mhm.
So now we understand that the intention for the Mexican and Indian populations is to reproduce them.
Mhm.
That's the face of the state, right? That's the naked face of the state. When we think about what the state wants to do to migrant populations, it is to forcibly reproduce them. This is why the right to choose is very important. And here's another thing. If you think about eugenics in another context, in the white supremacist context, the right to reproduce is not applied the same to the white population, right? So the right to reproduce is inherent for white women. White women must reproduce, actually. And so their freedom to choose is always being mitigated because white supremacists want to create a theocratic ethno state of white Christians in the US. So white women are almost always subject to even more regulation around the ability to have an abortion. So the higher proximity that you have to whiteness, the more likely you are to have regulations in like, especially if you see this in highly concentrated in white neighborhoods
Mm.
where there are a lot more Republicans who believe that white women need to reproduce, and that because they need to reproduce, it will be able to produce a more white nation. And this, of course, goes back to the Great White Replacement theory. So reproductive rights are very different depending on who you're talking to. And if you're talking to a population that doesn't produce labor, then and that they represent a legal claim to something, this is actually something that's happening to the Black American that I think is very interesting. Black people previously, because of their enslavement, because of their contributions to the American capitalist system, they were valued and were being forcibly reproduced. That was a part of the genocide campaign that happened to Black Americans. After Jim Crow laws, they were being disproportionately killed. More people died during Jim Crow and Black codes than during the era of enslavement. This is again, and I've said this in our last podcast, because the Black American was perceived as no longer having a utility. And in the modern age, Black Americans do have a claim to this country because they built it. They built this country. They represent a legal claim of reparations,
Mhm.
similar to Indigenous people, right? Indigenous people obviously have a natural territorial claim to the United States because of their birth. It's their birthright, it belongs to them.
Mhm.
And this representation causes the US state to advocate for their ethnic cleansing. And in fact, in my opinion, this is my opinion, and I know that it's going to get a lot of people tight, but Mexicans also represent a legal claim to the US.
Mhm.
So oftentimes you see a confusion amongst the elites about whether or not to reproduce Mexican people or to exterminate them,
Mhm.
because they represent a legal claim to at least the southwestern part to US territories. And in fact, a lot of Mexican people have history that's traceable to the US, meaning that they have a birthright claim to the territory if they identify within their indigeneity. And a lot of these populations, these indigenous populations, were originally seasonally migratory. So you
Mhm.
have a nomadic group of people that have a legal claim to American territory. They are Native Americans, essentially.
Mhm.
So the US has a lot of confusion about what to do with Mexican people, and it often either advocates for their extermination or it advocates for their reproduction, depending on the relationship that it has to labor.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, at least in California, it did used to be Mexico, and depending on which side of the that border you were on when that line was drawn, you could have either become indigenous Mexican or indigenous to America. But I feel like growing up, a lot of the stereotype around Mexicans, at least for Asians, was that Mexicans would have a lot of children. That was like the often the stereotype.
Yeah, and that has a direct relationship to the fact that the US wanted to regulate the ability for Mexican people to produce children, because
Yeah.
during the Bracero era, which was a program specifically designed to import Mexican labor, they wanted Mexican migrant workers
Mhm.
because they were essentially the foundation of the capitalist system after they weren't able to extract labor from Black people anymore. The face just turned its eye on another population entirely. In fact,
Mhm.
a lot of academic papers claim, and have backed up by years and years of evidence, including Black scholars, that the migration system as well as the prison system are the new systems of enslavement.
Mm.
There are so many cases, endless cases of wage theft of Mexican migrants because they
Mm.
don't have papers. What could they do if a plantation owner takes them and forces them to work and doesn't pay them?
Right.
So many cases, thousands and thousands and thousands of cases, billions and billions and trillions of dollars lost because there is no legal protection for migrants who are working in the US.
It happens all the time too. It's really common for people to not get paid and not be able to do anything about it.
Yeah, even legal cases,
Yeah.
even people who have the legal backing to be able to contest it, they still often lose these cases because they don't have enough money to be able to seize their wages back. Wage theft is like one of the biggest crimes in the United States. It's one of the biggest crimes in the United States. Like I think about that all the time. So when it comes to reproductive rights, we really have to think about your relationship to labor. And here's another like factor that most people don't think about. There's this concept called reproductive labor, and it's
Mm,
by a woman called Sylvia Federici. She wrote a book called The Caliban and the Witch, which treats specifically about this issue of reproductive labor.
mm,
Reproductive labor is unpaid labor that women do. I should say, people who have children do,
mhm,
where they raise the child from birth all the way to adulthood. This is
mm.
unpaid labor, right? Did you know that it used to be paid
Really? When?
in feudal Europe? And indigenous
Mm.
populations used to pay for it too.
Would the actual birthing process be paid too? I mean, I feel like that
No,
would count as
no,
labor.
it should count as labor, but that's that's a moment, right?
Okay.
But what we're talking about is the labor around educating a child, the
Okay,
labor
okay.
around nursing a child, the labor around wiping a child's ass.
Yeah,
You have to you produce a family. You're
yeah.
producing a family. You're literally producing a family. And it used to be paid. In feudal Europe, it was a paid profession. In fact, I talked a little bit about this on my TikTok a while back, but Claudia Scheinbaum institutionalized a reform that gave women pensions who had children in acknowledgement of reproductive labor. So if you
Mm,
were over 60, you're receiving an additional stipend to your pension. If you don't have one, especially, you're getting a pension if all you did was have a child because you contributed to the Mexican working class. It's an
mhm,
acknowledgement of reproductive labor.
mhm,
Having a child should absolutely be a part of a paid profession because it's unrealistic to say that a woman can potentially be a mother or like even like a single father, right? If we really want to like be inclusive here.
mhm,
If you're a single father, a single mother, and you raise a child from birth all the way to adulthood, that is a financial contribution to the American capitalist system.
mm,
You have to take huge losses to your own income. That's
mhm,
that's direct evidence of that. So when we take that into account and we start noticing that the US implements reproductive rights indiscriminately, right? Whether that is the right to reproduce or the right to not reproduce, that has very specific implications for what reproductive labor means.
mm. I feel like each of those groups has a different part in the capitalist working class.
Yes, they're stratified intentionally because the logic of white supremacy isn't consistent also.
That's
That's
true.
that's the other thing is that to expect it to be always consistent is not really that helpful, but it can help you predict what they're going to do next. And this is obvious because the indigenous genocide has continued, right?
It's almost done, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah, indigenous North Americans represent less than 2% of the population.
Right.
Meanwhile, it's interesting because 18% of the population is Black Americans.
Mhm,
That is a much bigger population than Native Americans.
mhm,
And I think that speaks to the direct relationship to how the US is exploiting those populations. And more interestingly still, a massive population is Latino in the US. It's
mhm,
one of the biggest populations in the US. It's a majority minority.
mm,
So that should say what the relationship of the state is. And I think that one of the reasons that these deportation campaigns are being carried out, especially against Venezuelans and Central and South Americans, is because they represent a legal claim to American wealth. They represent a legal claim, meaning that they have contributed, Latinos have contributed to the American system so
Uh-huh.
much that they obviously have a legal claim to the wealth that the US has produced for itself.
Mhm.
And I think that's true for most people who do not have reparations in the US after US atrocities. That includes, of course, Black Americans and other indigenous populations that are bordering, for example, not recognized Mexican populations that were expulsed during the Mexico American War.
Mhm.
All of these populations that were deeply affected by US hegemony and US capitalism. Furthermore, I think that's also why we're seeing a huge expulsion and criminalization of Palestinians and Arab Americans, because
Mm.
they are an indigenous population that has a legal claim in the Middle East, and the US has exported its systems of oppression to the Middle East.
Mm. Well, also what I was wondering too is that with maybe this is aside, but with Israel, obviously they're doing the eradicating the indigenous population, but are they doing the slavery piece?
Yes, they've actually been bringing in Indians.
Oh,
Yeah, which relates back to what I was saying earlier. They
yeah.
have a relationship there because they're exterminating the Muslim population.
I see. I see.
But right now, their primary focus is the extermination of indigenous people, which was the same thing for the US at their colony. It actually began with the extermination of indigenous people. It wasn't until they had a significant enough population of Black slaves that they actually took those slaves and turned them on indigenous people too.
Oh. Yeah, and they're like America in the 1770s.
Yeah, well, actually, also, if you didn't know, they took Black slaves to Vietnam.
I did know about that,
Yeah.
actually.
This is like a common practice for the US.
Yeah.
They forcibly conscripted Black folks in, and this is actually still true. It's not forced though. It's like technically not forced. It's obviously a product of labor exploitation.
Mhm.
They take people who are non-citizens and they give them citizenship. So they hold citizenship over the head as long as they conscript
Yeah.
to the American military. So you get to become an American citizen if you go and commit genocide overseas.
Right, right. Anyways, I hope, China takes over.
Yeah, China doesn't have these systems. And this is why I think people really need to be clear about what China is. Because a lot of people say that China is a capitalist system, China is an imperial state. Chinese imperialism was nothing like American imperialism. It was nothing like it. And this can be the evidence is directly can be viewed by the fact that the US has military bases all over the world. It is the only country that has this.
Mhm. That's true.
It is the only country that has institutionalized its fascism all over the world formally. In enemy territory, even. Guantanamo Bay is in Cuba.
Mhm.
Like, Guantanamo Bay is in a communist country that directly opposes the US. Like that is like absolutely it is just not comparable. And also, Chinese ethnic minorities have institutionalized legal protections and they've always had them since the inception of the Chinese state. And currently, the ethnic minorities of China do have some stratification. There are some legal protections that they are still working and protesting for and all of that other stuff. But it just cannot be compared to the US. It cannot be compared to the US's history. And in
Mhm.
fact, the only time that Chinese hegemony, or the only time that Chinese people deeply stratified their local population was after US intervention.
What are your predictions for the next 4 years?
Well, when it comes to reproductive rights, we're going to see the naked face of the American state. We're going to see, particularly the Trump administration, is really going to expose the intentions of the American empire. This is because Donald Trump is a true white supremacist, but he's the kind that is like a benevolent white supremacist. He doesn't believe he's a white supremacist. He thinks he's just like a Christian, whereas he's being managed by people who are much smarter than them, who are actual white supremacists, who are not benevolent white supremacists. It's like JD Vance,
Mhm.
Elon Musk, and even his children. Those are all explicit white supremacists.
Mhm.
There are people who truly believe that white people are the master race. And so, because he's being managed by these people, he is going to act accordingly, meaning that he is going to start institutionalizing policies that please them. So we're going to start seeing the naked face of the state. Some companies are probably going to have interest in keeping some marginalized people in the US. Some of them are going to continue to work to criminalize migrants, especially those that speak out against the genocide that's happening in Palestine, because obviously the US has a vested interest in Palestine. And so having a people that represent a population that has a legal claim to Palestine they're going to be exterminated. And now, where reproductive rights is concerned, there is going to be a huge crackdown on abortion. It's coming. It's coming. I can pretty much guarantee that, federally speaking, what's going to happen this year is that abortion is probably going to be completely eliminated, even
Mm.
in states.
Mm. Better
Because,
stock up on that Plan B.
yeah, because white supremacists are going to try to produce more white people, and they're going to try to forcibly produce a working class.
Mm.
Because the other thing is that fascism directly leads to economic outcomes that are horrendous. Like, literally, we're seeing it already. That's clear as day. Because fascists are operating unilaterally, meaning that they don't have the purview of people who have an actual economic knowledge. And Trump is illiterate, so he doesn't know what he's doing when he's imposing these tariffs, when he's taking them off, because fascists are actually not very smart people. If they believe in pseudoscience, such as like the Heron Volk or white supremacy, right? Then they don't have a knowledge of like what their policy is going to do
Mm-hmm.
at large. They only know that they believe in their master race, and so they're going to continue to move in that direction. And if that's their priority, if that's their North Star, then they're going to completely ignore any potential negative ramifications that could come out of institutionalizing these racist policies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as reproductive health care goes, certainly there's going to be an even bigger crackdown. And what I think is going to be surprising to most Americans is that the Democrats are going to directly work in tandem with Republicans to allow for this crackdown on abortion rights.
I would not be surprised at all.
But the Democrats are going to be surprised, and especially liberal
That's true.
Americans. Liberal Americans are going to be surprised. They're going to be surprised when they see people like Gavin Newsom
Yeah.
crack down on abortion in
Mm-hmm.
California. We're going to see the same thing happen in New York.
He's
All of
already
these,
slipping.
yes, all of these liberal paradises that people think that are going to work in their favor, where people are running to, all
Mm-hmm.
of the countries that they think that they're going to be liberal paradises that they can run to, those countries, especially if they're under the subjugation of the US thumb, wherever the US can, it's going to force those countries to impose a much wider range of criminalization of abortion. Guaranteed, especially if they're European.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they're European. I think that that is going to lead to potentially abortion rights being mitigated in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also going to lead to more funding by the US for conservative political agendas in France and in Europe at large, especially the UK. And I think it's also going to be a bigger crackdown on countries that have a lot of natural resources. So there's going to be more US intervention.
That makes sense. They're already starting up.
Yeah, well, we saw, what was it? We saw a couple attempts on Mexico already of US intervention.
Yeah.
And we've also seen this happen in Venezuela. This was, of course, last year under a Democrat. No
Mm-hmm.
surprises there. And we started to see more recently more crackdowns on Cuba and Haiti. And of course, the Trump administration is cracking down dramatically on China.
What would you recommend that people do at this point in time?
I think that we have to really understand a couple things about fascism, especially dictatorships. I think people really think that the US or that other countries are going to come to a complete halt. because fascism began. I think people have this understanding that like the world stops when dictatorships rise. But there have been dictatorships, American backed dictatorships, for years. And nobody has stopped anything from happening. In fact, there's been a genocide, an overt genocide happening in Palestine. And Americans in general have moved on with their lives. They generally and genuinely do not care unless it directly affects them. This is common US practice. And even when the US was intervening in Mexico, the average American didn't know or didn't care. So that's the first thing. We have to understand that most people are not going to feel the effects of fascism until it's too late. Truly, until it's too late. And by that point, wherever you are in the world will really, really depend on what you can do and what you should do. But I will say this, it starts with people getting organized, right? Fascism is not a permanent state. Nazi Germany lasted 7 years. And within those 7 years, there were people still doing resistance and there were people still living their daily lives. You know, I saw a video recently of people talking about the Pinochet dictatorship, and there was a concentration camp across the school from a kindergarten, and there were people who were in the concentration camp being exterminated, and they were listening to the laughter of children. Daily life like continues under fascism. It's not something that you will notice, or there won't be like a sign that pops up on your TV screen like the movies like to make it seem like. When we had American backed dictatorships in Mexico, all we saw was an uptick in violence, an uptick in cartel disappearances. All we saw was more um, erosion of Mexican rights in Mexico. All we saw was a much bigger disproportionate use of force by the police on vulnerable populations. That's really all we saw. We didn't see an immediate sort of like announcement or something where the world was like, oh my gosh, there's a dictatorship in Mexico. That didn't happen, and that won't happen for the US either.
Hmm.
So, as far as what people can do, they need to get organized. You need to know who your neighbors are, first of all.
Yeah.
And you need to coordinate with them. You need to find out what their politics are.
Hmm.
You need to know what their marginalizations are. And you need to realize that like things are about to get really, really expensive.
Hmm.
And that expense is going to lead to people acting very desperately.
Yep.
That desperation should be handled with compassion
Hmm.
because people who survive dictatorships have friends.
Hmm.
You have friends, you have a community. You have people who are willing to die for the safety of the group, of the whole.
Hmm.
And that is how you survive. Like, I think people don't understand that there were Jewish people that weren't in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. There were Jewish people all over Nazi Germany who did survive.
Hmm.
You had all sorts of marginalized people throughout all dictatorships survive. There are still, Turkey is currently in a dictatorship.
Hmm.
So is Hungary. These two countries still, people are still going, they have to go grocery shopping, they still have to go to work, they still
Hmm.
have to go to school, they still have to continue doing their regular things.
Hmm.
What we're going to see instead is an uptick of police brutality. We're going to see an uptick of legislation against marginalized populations. We're going to see an infringement on American human rights. And all you can do is what activists have been asking people to continue to do and have been asking people to do for years.
Hmm.
And I will say, of course, the most obvious and overt thing is that American capitalism has to end. It has to end. This is not new to the United States. American fascism is not new. In fact, that is its oldest system. So if we understand that this is just an uptick on the bell curve, right? The distribution of dictatorial actions the US has taken has been a bell curve.
Hmm.
And there are legal institutions, there are activist institutions that are going to kick into gear right now that are going to support people. We are in a completely different era than we were in the past. That doesn't mean that we should go back to sleep or go back to brunch, but it does mean that we have to understand what situation we're in and that people's lives, they're going to move on, even under dictatorship. people's lives are gonna move on.
Mhm.
So those are my predictions, and that's what I think you should do.
I feel like people should stay. I know that a lot of people are leaving the country, but you should stay unless you're in like immediate danger of your life. You know, losing your life. Uh,
Most of the people that are leaving are privileged.
yeah, most of the people that are leaving have the ability and the resources to leave. What's going to happen is that this period of time will end, and the people who are doing the work, the brown folks that have to stay, are going to stay and do the work, and then the white folks will come back and be like, "Thanks for doing the work," But you should stay if you can.
I mean, I think generally Americans, it's a projection. Like, I think people leaving right now, educated, whatever, people who are fleeing other countries, it's not just that they're privileged, it's that they are essentially immune to the fascism.
Mm,
They're not going to experience the same crackdown, and this actually will accelerate the vulnerability for populations that can't afford to resist
mhm,
American fascism.
mhm,
So I think they should stay for a couple reasons. First, they're not vulnerable populations. People who are running away, who have not just the means, but they're not under threat. Like even if you are like a little bit marginalized, you're not being targeted yet. And that includes especially people who have never done any activism. Right now, the crackdown is happening specifically and explicitly on activists, and especially on migrants who are of populations that represent a nation that has resources that the US has a vested interest in.
mhm,
So it's not just that people should stay, it's that you leaving is actually accelerating the probability of the fascism becoming more solidified in more numbers. I do think that people should be more militant. And I think that what that means is you need to get fit. You need to get
mhm,
a gun. You need to understand your enemy. You
mhm,
need to practice operational security, meaning like you need to get connected with activist organizations who have a practical understanding of what resistance looks like. And you need to understand that like activism comes with risks. Doesn't matter what kind of activism you're doing, whether that's nonviolent direct action, whether that is um, civil disobedience, whether that is whatever action you're planning on taking, it really does not matter. You have to have some kind of basic understanding of operational security. And you can also participate in those things in varying degrees. Not everybody has to be militant. Not everybody has to be a brain behind the protests. Some
mhm,
people just need to show up with a sign, and it doesn't have to be dramatic. Like the fall of the U.S. empire still has potential of not turning into barbarism if people just get their act right. But if
mhm,
you leave, it guarantees that the U.S. is going to turn into barbarism. And what that's going to look like is, I mean, I can tell you this is what exactly what happened in Mexico. There were mass extermination campaigns that were targeted at students. The minute that we see students being fired on with live munitions, that's when we really know that it's here. That's actually your sign. But just know that if you leave or if you haven't done anything to resist this, you are giving permission to the state to do those things.
mhm,
And it's not going to stop here. It's going to follow you wherever you go
mhm,
because Western countries are the only ones who are safe from American military attacks. But that doesn't mean that they won't attack the working class in other countries.
mhm,
And Canada, Mexico, third world countries, global south countries, all of these countries are subject to military attacks by the US. And the first countries that they're going to come to are in immediate proximity. They're already starting to do it with Canada. So I'm not trying to make people scared, but I do think people should understand that your role doesn't have to be a dramatic one. You just have to be a cog in the working class machine rather than in the capitalist machine.
Yeah, I mean, all the white trans people that I see leaving, we need you here. This is like this is how you use your white privilege. This is the moment. Um, yeah, that's all. That's all I gotta say. I think we can wrap it up for today.
All right. Well, that concludes our general topic. Thanks again for tuning in to Liberacion Army Radio. This was episode 6 of our podcast. It aired on May 1st, 2025. We talked about Judge Hannah Dugan, Dean Withers and the Unfuck America Tour, Ibrahim Traore, the Pope, as well as the migrant cases updates. And finally, we talked about the general topic, which was systems of American oppression and future predictions. Hope to see you, hopefully, next Monday. I do have a few more finals, so hopefully there won't be any delays, but if there are, you'll know why.